What if the voices that shaped your childhood, those trusted faces on screens, those charming smiles under studio lights, weren't who they claimed to be? What if behind the applause, behind the charity galas and comedy skits, there was something else? Something no one wanted to admit. Until it was too late. This isn't just a list of names. It's a slow unraveling of Britain's golden age of fame. And by the end, you might find yourself wondering how many of our national treasures were just wolves in tuxedos. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe if you're into unsettling truths and long walks through the darker corners of fame. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Let's see who else is out there, wide awake with us. 1. Jimmy Savile. It begins, as it always does, with a man the nation trusted far too much. A man in a tracksuit and gold chains, sitting between prime ministers and patients in hospital wards, spinning records for children and fundraising for the sick. Jimmy Savile was everywhere, on top of the pops, in the pages of the tabloids, in the hearts of charity campaigns, in the corridors of power. A jester for the public, a saint for the institutions, a monster behind the curtain. For decades he existed in a strange orbit where sleaze was part of the brand. The jokes were always there, just disguised as banter, buried under smirks and celebrity immunity. You were supposed to laugh, and if you didn't, you were the problem. He raised millions for hospitals, appeared on children's television, and received a knighthood. All the while, behind the scenes, he wielded access like a weapon, slipping through hospitals, prisons, backstage corridors. It wasn't subtle. That was the horror of it. The scale only became clear after his death. In 2012, the walls cracked open. Testimonies poured out like floodwater, disturbing, detailed, countless. It wasn't just one institution that failed. It was all of them. The BBC, the NHS, the police, everyone. They either didn't know, pretended not to, or let it slide under the weight of reputation. The phrase hiding in plain sight became tragically literal. And yet, even in the aftermath, the question lingered. How does a nation miss something that obvious for that long? The answer is uncomfortable. He played the part people needed him to play, eccentric, charitable, untouchable. And in return, they let him roam. His crimes were the kind that fed on silence. And silence, it turns out, was abundant. When the reckoning came, it was too late for justice. But not too late for a legacy of institutional shame. The reviews, reports, and apologies came fast and dry. They still do. And yet, the image remains. Savile, grinning, golden, waving from the hospital steps, while the whole world mistook proximity for trust. The lesson was supposed to be learned. But then another man, in another jumper, was found guilty too. A man who painted on screen, smiled for children, and played a didgeridoo. 2. Rolf Harris. He painted the Queen. He made animals sing. He stood before classrooms and royal galas alike with that grandfatherly twinkle. Just enough chaos to be funny. Just enough warmth to be adored. Rolf Harris was what happens when kitsch becomes a mask and the man behind it keeps smiling while the rot sets in. In the public eye, he was a harmless oddity, a wobble-board maestro from down under who made it big in Britain. He charmed his way through screens for decades, always with a chuckle and a cartoon kangaroo in tow. Children loved him. Adults found him endearing. Few suspected what lay underneath. Those who did, it seems, were not taken seriously. But in 2014, everything collapsed. He was convicted of a series of historical indecent assaults, most against girls, committed during the height of his fame. The verdict didn't just shock the public, it disoriented it. Harris had been, in many ways, the anti-Savile. Warm, jokey, seemingly transparent. There were no rumors in smoke-filled rooms, just history, suddenly catching up with a national uncle. The details were grim, the patterns familiar. Power and access. Fame and invisibility. A man moving through dressing rooms and studios like he belonged there. And perhaps he did, but not for the reasons everyone thought. His victims had spoken of a strange duality, the public performer and the private predator. The mask never slipped, until it did. When his conviction came down, there was a collective stunned silence, followed by the familiar cleanup. His honors were stripped, his portraits taken down, his programming pulled from broadcast. The erasure was swift, but the discomfort remained. This wasn't about one man. It was about a system that kept handing him the microphone. Even then, some of the charges didn't stick. One of his convictions was later overturned, a legal footnote that complicated the narrative. But the weight of the remaining findings kept him firmly in disgrace. He died in 2023, quietly, out of sight. The country barely noticed. Or perhaps it noticed too much. But Harris wasn't alone in that twilight era of British entertainment. There was another face, less famous, but no less trusted. A man who made games feel innocent, even while something far more sinister was unfolding behind his television grin. If you're still with us after that, you're the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Go ahead and subscribe. It keeps the stories coming and the spotlight sharp. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you in too deep at 3 a.m. or just starting your day with a dose of uncomfortable truth? 3. Stuart Hall. If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, you probably remember the laughter, the surreal games, grown men in foam suits slipping over soap-slicked obstacle courses. And at the center of it all, Stuart Hall, chuckling like a man who'd found the absurd heart of British television and decided to live inside it forever. Its a knockout was ridiculous, chaotic, utterly harmless fun, or so it seemed. Stuart Hall's voice became the soundtrack of a more innocent kind of television. He was never quite a household name in the glamorous sense, but he was a reliable fixture, a kind of benevolent narrator with his theatrical voice and booming charm. A comforting presence, a company man. But the charm, as it turned out, was paper thin. When the post-Savile investigations began in earnest, the public suddenly discovered that Hall's genial TV persona had concealed decades of misconduct. In 2013, he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of indecent assault involving underage girls stretching across the height of his career. It was another crack in the facade of golden age broadcasting, where the smiling faces on screen often came with shadows attached. His confession shocked many, not just for the acts, but for the duplicity. Hall had initially dismissed the accusations as pernicious, callous, cruel, and spurious. But within months, the truth emerged. His statement was hollow, his reputation demolished. What followed was a brief, brutal collapse, stripped of honors, jailed, forgotten. He faded from public life almost as quickly as he had appeared in it decades earlier. And yet, his story lingers, not because of who he was, but because of how familiar the pattern became. The BBC, once again, found itself scrutinized. Questions were asked about who knew what and when, about whether the culture of light entertainment had shielded too many, too often. It wasn't just a question of legal guilt. It was a reckoning with the moral rot hiding behind the laughter. Stuart Hall wasn't the most powerful man in the room, but he didn't have to be. All he needed was the glow of the cameras and the warmth of public affection, because sometimes that's more than enough to build a wall no one dares look behind. And yet, that wall kept crumbling. Because just around the corner, another voice, famously smooth, famously loud, was about to take the fall too. A man whose name still echoes in the corridors of radio nostalgia, where records spun and red lights blinked, and no one asked too many questions. 4. Dave Lee Travis. He called himself the Hairy Cornflake. It was a nickname that felt too silly to be sinister, so no one thought it might be. For years, Dave Lee Travis was a staple of British radio, his deep, syrupy voice slipping through the nation's airwaves with the lazy confidence of a man who knew how much people liked to hear him talk. He was comfortable, well-loved, and just cheeky enough to be harmless. Or so it seemed. Travis was part of a cohort of men who rode the wave of BBC light entertainment in its heyday. Long hair, loud shirts, backstage passes. They weren't just voices, they were gatekeepers of culture, controlling the sounds and rhythms of Britain's youth. But behind the levity was something less innocent. In 2014, Travis was found guilty of 1 count of indecent assault, part of a broader set of allegations that had followed him into the post-U-Tree spotlight. His case wasn't as clear-cut as others. He was acquitted on multiple charges, and the one conviction involved an incident backstage at a television show in the 90s. But in the court of public opinion, the damage was done. The trial, drawn out, media-saturated, cast a long shadow over his legacy. Even 1 count, the public reasoned, was enough. And maybe it was. Travis maintained his innocence, describing the investigations as a witch hunt, and lamenting the loss of his reputation. But the deeper discomfort wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about how easily the era's culture of unchecked behavior had thrived under the veneer of showbiz eccentricity. The 70s and 80s had been painted in hues of sexual freedom and backstage antics, a time when being handsy was just part of the job, or so they joked. But those jokes aged badly. And when the reckoning came, it was less about individual monsters and more about the ecosystem that let them grow. Dave Lee Travis wasn't the biggest name in the headlines, but he was emblematic. Of a type, of a time, of a tone that once passed for harmless fun. The microphones may have gone silent, but the echoes are still there, and just when it felt like the list might slow down, in walked a man who wasn't just close to fame, he managed it. A man who built stars, spun scandal, and eventually found himself at the center of one. 5. Max Clifford. Max Clifford didn't act. He didn't sing. He didn't host variety shows or dance across the stage in sequence. What he did was far more powerful. And, as it turns out, far more dangerous. Clifford built and destroyed reputations for a living. A master publicist, a tabloid whisperer, and a self-styled kingmaker who understood that perception was everything. Behind every scandalous front page in 1990s Britain, there was a good chance Clifford's fingerprints were somewhere in the margins. He called himself the gatekeeper to celebrity secrets. For decades, he was the go-to fixer for stars in trouble, politicians in damage control, and opportunists seeking 15 minutes of curated fame. He didn't just know where the skeletons were buried, he often handed out the shovels. And while he helped others spin their stories, he kept his own image conveniently clean. Savvy, cheeky, always 1 step ahead. But eventually, the spotlight turned inward. In 2014, Clifford was convicted of multiple counts of indecent assault, all involving incidents that occurred during his peak as a media manipulator. The charges spanned decades, and the victims' testimonies painted a picture of a man who had treated access and influence as a license to behave however he pleased. He used his office like a stage, and his charm like currency. When the verdict came, the irony was impossible to ignore. The man who made headlines now was one. The architect of image collapsed beneath his own. His carefully crafted persona, smirking, untouchable, shattered in a courtroom as the stories emerged, and the media, once his plaything, turned on him with ruthless precision. Clifford died in prison in 2017, halfway through his sentence. But his legacy lingered, mostly as a cautionary tale. He represented a different kind of predator, not the star but the handler, not the man on the stage but the one pulling the strings. He didn't need to be adored, he just needed to be feared, or needed. His fall was dramatic, but it didn't stop the tide. Because while Clifford shaped other scandals, another man had made his own fame on screen. A young actor loved by families who once stood under studio lights, before a very different kind of spotlight found him decades later. 6. John Alford. In the 1990s, John Alford was the kind of actor you'd let into your living room without a second thought. He played firefighters and schoolboys, characters full of pluck and charm. A regular on Grange Hill and London's Burning, he embodied that rare type of early career British fame. Accessible, unthreatening, and destined, everyone thought, for bigger things. But fame at a young age is rarely a stable foundation, and Alford's career stumbled more than it soared. Off-screen, things spiraled. First, it was the familiar path of tabloids, parties, and minor scandals. A sting operation in the early 2000s caught him selling drugs to undercover reporters, an already disorienting fall from grace. But what came next was darker and more definitive. In 2026, Alford was sentenced for serious offenses involving underage victims, marking a final, jarring end to the slow-motion collapse of his public image. The media, predictably, swarmed. But this wasn't the tale of a hidden abuser whose crimes stretched decades. It was a different kind of tragedy. A fall not from legend, but from the brittle scaffolding of short-lived fame. Alford had faded into semi-obscurity before the charges emerged. For many, his name resurfacing at all was a surprise, quickly followed by disgust. The court proceedings left little ambiguity. The pattern, the manipulation, the misuse of celebrity status, it was all there. And yet, unlike the towering figures before him, Alford's story wasn't about systemic failure or institutional shielding. It was about a man who had just enough leftover fame to exploit, and just enough public memory to make the fall sting. His sentencing reignited debates about the enduring privilege of fame even decades after its peak. Had his status once protected him from scrutiny, or had it simply delayed the inevitable? There was no long institutional inquiry, no cultural post-mortem, just a quiet, bitter ending to a career that had long since gone silent. But even as Alford's story closed, another was still echoing. A man whose career thrived in the glare of tabloid chaos. A man who became infamous not for what he was convicted of, but for what he was accused of, and the courtroom drama that followed. Because sometimes, the allegation becomes the legacy. 7. Freddy Starr. Freddy Starr was never subtle. He didn't need to be. His comedy was loud, chaotic, and often one pratfall away from total nonsense. He was a tabloid staple, a household name, and a kind of walking punchline to the British entertainment scene of the 70s and 80s. He famously, allegedly, ate a hamster. Or so the Sun told us. He denied it, of course, but in the world of Starr, denial often sat comfortably next to the absurd. That was the game. His was the era of glittery suits and game show mayhem, of smoky backstage corridors and comedians who were paid to push boundaries long before anyone had drawn them. Starr thrived in that chaos. He didn't just tell jokes, he became one. Volatile, unpredictable, larger than life. He seemed like a relic from a time when fame was raw and fame was fast. But in the wake of the Savile revelations, names started resurfacing. Starr's was one of them. In the early 2010s, a woman publicly alleged that Starr had assaulted her during a backstage appearance in the 1970s. The claim was specific, detailed, and ultimately led to a civil defamation case, because Starr didn't take the accusation quietly. He sued for libel, declaring the allegation false and damaging to his reputation. It was his name, his legacy, on the line. And then he lost. The court ruled against him, not because it found him guilty of a crime. This wasn't a criminal trial, but because the legal standard of defamation wasn't met. The accusation stood in the public record, and Starr's attempt to clear his name collapsed under cross-examination. He left the courtroom a defeated man, the same way many others from that glitter-soaked generation were leaving public life, not with convictions, but with question marks. He never fully recovered from the reputational damage. He moved to Spain, far from the spotlight, and died in relative obscurity in 2019. For some, the absence of a conviction meant the story stopped there. For others, The public airing of the allegation was enough to change how they remembered him. As with so many of his peers, the legacy blurred. But Starr's wasn't the last name to resurface in that era of reckoning, because while comedians faded and entertainers were re-examined, one name stood out. Not for jokes, but for baselines. A man whose voice boomed from radios and whose reputation, like so many others, began to crack when the volume was finally turned down. 8. Tim Westwood. Tim Westwood didn't emerge from the traditional halls of British broadcasting. He crashed into them, mic in hand, with a voice that sounded like someone had dropped an East London accent into a blender with an American rap DJ. To some, he was a cultural translator. To others, a parody of one. But for better or worse, he was everywhere. On the BBC, in the clubs, behind the decks at events that merged youth culture with celebrity. He built his brand on swagger, streetwise, connected, edgy. Westwood wasn't just a broadcaster. He was an institution in the UK hip-hop scene. For decades, he shaped what young listeners heard, who got airtime, what trends caught fire. He didn't just play music. He was music, or so the branding went. But over time, the public persona began to shift. Whispered stories, vague references, moments that felt off in hindsight. Then, in 2022, those whispers turned into headlines. Multiple women came forward with serious allegations spanning decades. They described patterns of predatory behavior and abuse of power within the music and nightlife scenes. The BBC distanced itself. Old footage resurfaced, and suddenly, the man who had once been untouchable was under a very different kind of scrutiny. In 2025, Westwood was formally charged with multiple serious offenses. The media coverage was extensive, but restrained. No trial had yet taken place. No verdict had been delivered. But the atmosphere had shifted. The accusations alone had been enough to sever long-standing ties, erase professional histories, and prompt others to come forward. The charges weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern echoed by many across multiple platforms. And still, the presumption of innocence remains. Legally, Westwood is not convicted. The trial is pending. The system, in theory, works to protect both accuser and accused until a verdict is reached. But public opinion rarely waits for a gavel. What's perhaps most unsettling is how familiar the rhythm has become. The rise, the reverence, the reckoning. The same beat playing on loop, different names, different scenes, same silence. And then, from the music world to the cobbled streets of a soap opera, we move again. To a man who has played one of Britain's most enduring TV characters for over half a century, and whose name, too, found itself in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. 9. William Roache. For over half a century, William Roache has been Ken Barlow. Since 1960, he's walked the cobbled streets of Coronation Street, aging in real time as Britain's longest-serving soap actor. He was stability in a world that rarely offered it. Generations grew up watching him settle into chairs, sip tea, argue about politics, and deliver monologues that felt more grandfatherly than performative. In a medium built on melodrama, Roache was the calm. But in 2013, the calm cracked. Roache was charged with historic offenses that allegedly dated back to the 1960s and 70s, a time when his career was already underway and his celebrity growing. The news came during the height of post-U-Tree scrutiny, when the past wasn't staying in the past. And suddenly, one of television's most enduring faces was caught in the tide. The public reaction was split. For many, the accusations were hard to reconcile with the persona. Ken Barlow wasn't glamorous, wasn't reckless, wasn't menacing. He was safe, even boring. But in that contrast lay the discomfort. Could longevity and familiarity really shield someone from suspicion forever? The case went to trial. Witnesses testified, headlines speculated, and then, in 2014, the court found him not guilty on all counts, acquitted. cleared. He returned to work not long after. ITV welcomed him back, and his face reappeared in living rooms like nothing had happened. For some, the legal resolution closed the door. For others, the allegations lingered in memory, filed away under the growing category of not proven but not forgotten. Roache's case became emblematic of the era's moral tension. When should suspicion remain after a verdict? Does the shadow of an allegation fade with a judge's ruling, or stay in the cultural bloodstream, half-remembered and quietly influential? And yet, to this day, William Roache continues on Coronation Street, now in his 90s. His story, at least professionally, remains largely uninterrupted. But his presence in the wider narrative of public reckoning is a reminder that even legal clarity doesn't erase the social unease that trails behind accusations, especially when those accusations touch a symbol of stability. Still, Roache was not the only entertainer of that era who found himself under the lens of police scrutiny. The next man, another face from vintage television, wore the suit of the classic entertainer. Polished, primetime ready, and suddenly, like so many others, investigated. 10. Jimmy Tarbuck. Jimmy Tarbuck was the smiling face of British variety television. He wore tuxedos, told gentle jokes, and played golf with prime ministers. He was the kind of entertainer who made light work of being liked, never too edgy, never too strange, just enough sparkle to keep the audience leaning in. For decades, he floated on a current of safe nostalgia, the kind that made people sigh and say, "They don't make 'em like that anymore." But the wave of post-Savile investigations didn't just wash over the notorious names. It swept through the middle class of celebrity, too. And in 2013, Tarbuck was arrested as part of an inquiry into historic abuse allegations. It was sudden, jarring, and deeply uncomfortable for those who had grown up watching him crack jokes on Saturday night TV. The details were sparse, and the case didn't go far. After months of investigation, he was released without charge. The police didn't pursue it further. Legally, that was the end of it. But in the court of public memory, things are never so tidy. The arrest had already been public, the name already linked to the broader scandal era. For many, even the suggestion was enough to blur his reputation. For others, the fact that he wasn't charged was the only thing that mattered. It became another line in the growing conversation about justice, privacy, and the consequences of historical allegations, especially when the accused were elderly men who had spent their lives in the public eye. Tarbuck's story is less about guilt or innocence, and more about visibility. Once your name appears in that context, it rarely disappears. Even with no charges, no trial, and no verdict, the association lingers. In interviews, he expressed frustration, confusion, and hurt over the ordeal. But like many in his generation, his voice got quieter as the years went on. He never returned to the peak of public affection he once held, but he wasn't fully cast out either. He became a symbol of the ambiguous middle ground, where suspicion doesn't lead to sentencing but still takes up residence. And then, of course, there was a case even murkier, a story not of charges or convictions, but of death. A suspicious one, a mystery that never quite closed. And at the center of it all, a man who once ruled British light entertainment with a grin, a pool, and a party that ended in silence. 11. Michael Barrymore. Michael Barrymore used to be everywhere. In the late 80s and 90s, his smile was as familiar as the BBC logo itself. Saturday night television revolved around him. Families sat together, laughing at his game shows, his improv comedy, his carefully rehearsed chaos. He was the king of light entertainment, the kind of star who felt like a friend in the room rather than a distant celebrity on a screen. And then, in 2001, everything stopped. At a private party at Barrymore's home, a young man named Stuart Lubbock was found dead in the swimming pool. The initial shock was immediate. The story was surreal. A beloved television host, a quiet suburban street, flashing police lights, and a death that made no sense. When a post-mortem later suggested signs that the death might not have been accidental, the story shifted from tragic to deeply unsettling. Barrymore was never charged. He denied wrongdoing from the start. But the investigations didn't go away. Over the years, the case was reopened, reviewed, revisited. Police interviewed guests. Evidence was re-examined. The media circled, backed off, then returned again. Each time, the same frustrating conclusion: no one could be held criminally responsible. The mystery remained. What made the case so haunting wasn't just the lack of resolution. It was the way it hollowed out a career. Barrymore's shows vanished. His contracts dried up. A man who once commanded millions of viewers became a ghost of his former self, appearing only occasionally in interviews or reality television, trying to rebuild something that no longer had a foundation. In the public imagination, suspicion became a kind of shadow that followed him everywhere. Even without a conviction, the association with the unsolved death was enough to permanently alter how he was seen. For some, that was unfair. For others, unavoidable. The truth, whatever it is, never fully emerged. Barrymore's story sits in a strange category in this larger saga. He was not legally named as an offender, but he became part of a narrative about celebrity, excess, and the dangerous spaces where fame, parties, and power collide. A reminder that sometimes a career doesn't need a courtroom verdict to be destroyed. Sometimes all it takes is a question that never gets answered. And from unanswered questions, we move to a man whose name became one of the most infamous in British broadcasting. Not because of a verdict, but because of how a single allegation exploded across every front page in the country. 12. John Leslie. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, John Leslie was one of television's golden boys. Handsome, confident, and smooth in that distinctly British way, he fronted primetime entertainment shows and glossy reality formats. He was the face of a new generation of presenters, less formal, more flirtatious, and always camera-ready. Then, in 2003, his career detonated almost overnight. A high-profile memoir by a well-known woman described an alleged assault without naming him. But the media quickly did what the law forbade. Through speculation, gossip, and sources close to the situation, Leslie's identity was broadcast across newspapers and radio shows. By the time legal protections caught up, the damage was already done. His name was out there, and it never went back in. Leslie was later arrested and charged. A trial followed. The jury could not reach a verdict, and prosecutors ultimately dropped the case. Legally, that was it. No conviction, no finding of guilt. But in the court of public opinion, there was no acquittal either. His television career ended almost immediately. Contracts were canceled. Shows were recast. The presenter who once commanded huge audiences was suddenly unhireable. What made Leslie's case particularly unsettling was the way it exposed the collision between media frenzy and due process. He was effectively judged in the headlines long before any courtroom ever heard the evidence. Whether the allegations were true or not, his fate was sealed by publicity rather than a verdict. In interviews years later, Leslie spoke about the loneliness, the financial ruin, and the bitterness of being known for something he was never convicted of. For his accuser, the story was equally painful, defined by public scrutiny and the impossible burden of proving something that happened behind closed doors. It was a case that left no one whole, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting part of this era of revelations. Some stories end in prison cells. Others end in silence. Some leave behind certainty. Others leave behind scars and a question mark that never fades. And now, the list reaches its final name, a figure whose fame dwarfs all the others. A man from cinema's earliest golden age, a global icon. And yet, even in black and white, even in the flicker of silent film, the shadows still linger. 13. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin doesn't feel like he belongs in this list. That's what makes him so unsettling here. He isn't remembered as a television personality or a cheeky host in a loud studio. He is remembered as the face of cinema's innocence, the tramp wobbling through a cruel world with a bowler hat, a crooked cane, and a face that could make entire generations feel safe. Chaplin wasn't just famous. He was mythic, which is why his private life still reads like a quiet, unresolved contradiction. By the 1930s and 40s, Chaplin was one of the most powerful men in the film industry. He wrote, directed, starred, and owned his own studio. He didn't answer to anyone. And it was during this period that his relationships with very young women began to draw intense scrutiny. Some were legal under the standards of the time. Many were not. All were unsettling when viewed through the lens of power imbalance and control. One of the most infamous cases involved his marriage to Lita Gray, who was a teenager when they wed, and even younger when their relationship began. Their divorce became a public scandal, filled with allegations of emotional manipulation, coercion, and humiliation. The details were printed in newspapers across the world, stripping away the romantic glow of Chaplin's public image and replacing it with something colder, more calculating. Then came the Joan Barry case. Barry, a young actress, accused Chaplin of misconduct and later became pregnant. The U.S. government brought a Mann Act case against him, an old morality law used to prosecute men accused of transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. Chaplin was acquitted in that criminal case, but the civil fallout was brutal. A court ruled that he was the father of Barry's child, despite blood test evidence that, by modern standards, would likely have cleared him. At the time, however, such tests were inadmissible. So what was Chaplin? A victim of moral panic? Of a powerful man entangled in the flawed legal system of mid-century America? Or someone who repeatedly sought out women far younger and far less powerful than himself? Because he could? The uncomfortable answer is probably all three. Unlike many of the names on this list, Chaplin was not undone by one final revelation. His controversies were known in his lifetime. They were debated, litigated, sensationalized. He was eventually pushed out of the United States entirely, his reputation stained by a mixture of scandal, politics, and personal choices that refused to stay private. And yet, the film survived. That's the paradox that lingers with Chaplin. The tramp still makes people cry. The great dictator still feels brave. Modern times still feels gentle. The art is beautiful. The man was complicated. And the space between those two things has never been fully closed. Perhaps that is the final unease of this entire journey. Not every story ends with a verdict. Not every legacy fits neatly into good or evil. Some remain suspended between brilliance and darkness, forever forcing us to ask the same question in different voices. How much are we willing to look away, just to keep believing in the stories we love?